In my last video, I explained and explored what's called the documentary hypothesis and the other hypotheses that surround this that contemporary scholars take to prove how the Pentateuch was written by pretty much anyone but Moses, mostly much later monarchical or exilic or post-exilic authors that had their own propaganda that all contradicted each other, and yet, in the end, were all put next to each other and worked together with the genius of this final redactor. In that video, I deconstruct this documentary hypothesis and show its inconsistencies only within the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Now, while I do want to stand firm and show the viral inconsistencies with this hypothesis, at the same time, if you're paying attention as you read the Pentateuch, you'll notice that there are actually multiple times where there are sentences, phrases, clauses, whatever, that must have been made by somebody other than Moses. These are now referred to as Post-Mosaica, from the Latin meaning after Moses, of course, because these had to have been written after Moses. Now, there are some issues and rebuttals that can be made to this that I will handle with all at the end of this video. But for the current moment, I want to go through a list of all of these Post-Mosaica that you can find just in the text. I'm not going to be exploring the archeological Post-Mosaica, where scholars say that according to archaeology and what we've dug up, we can't find anything that approves this, or other types of evidences that some of these passages couldn't have been written by Moses. I'm just going to look at the passages that themselves make clear that Moses could not have written them. I'll explore the theological significance of these. Then I'll talk about how this kind of works with the New Testament and passages where Jesus refers to the law being written by Moses. And then I'll talk about the significance of this all. So if you haven't watched the last video, I would very much recommend that you watch that video and see, on the other hand, problems with a bunch of current scholarly hypotheses for the coming about of the Torah today. But for now, we're going to jump into these verses, go verse by verse. As I was reading through the Pentateuch this past couple months, actually just a single month, I had been taking note not only of inconsistencies in the documentary hypothesis, but also these post-Mosaica. So I found these myself, and I took notes on their significance and when I think they could have been written. So with that, we're going to jump into them. So starting off, we come across our first post-Mosaica in Genesis chapter 12 and the second half of verse 6. And this is right after God had called Abraham out of his land, and he calls him to go and leave his family. And he says that he's going to bless him. And in blessing him, he's going to bless all the families of the earth. And then Abraham makes an altar to God. He devotes himself to him. And it says, at that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Now, the very fact that they had to note at that time that the Canaanites were in the land, one, it says at that time. So it's referring to a previous time. Now, it might be argued that, well, this would be a previous time to Moses and his audience. So if he's writing for his contemporary audience, then they would be talking about a former time, saying at that time. Ever, Moses says that at that time, the Canaanites were in the land of Canaan. And now Moses has not entered into the land of Canaan, neither have the Israelites, and there hasn't been a conquest. The whole point of the conquest being, again, as God says in Deuteronomy, that it is punishment for the Canaanites and that their sin had filled up the land. And so he was going to clear and cleanse the land of them through Israel. So if there were Canaanites in the land, and this is a true statement, then Moses could not have written it. So if this is having to remind whoever is reading this that there were Canaanites in the land at that time, then it seems that the Israelites had destroyed the Canaanites in the land. So this could have been written by Joshua at the earliest. However, he wouldn't have needed to remind anyone in his audience that there were Canaanites in the land, because up until his time, they were in the land. So it seems actually even safer to attribute this passage to sometime, again, earliest at the beginning of Israel's monarchy, but probably sometime after, because again, David, for example, was still taking over the Jebusites, who originally owned Jerusalem before he took it over and made it and established it as Zion. So if they're needing to remind their audience that there were Canaanites in the land at that time, then it seems that it would have been sometime after they had at least taken out the majority of the Canaanites. So probably sometime after David. And this is significant because this is when God has first called Abraham to the land. He says, go to the place that I'll show you. And Abraham builds an altar and devotes himself to Yahweh. And he's doing this among the Canaanites. I remember that in Genesis chapter 15, God is going to say that it won't be until generations later, when the sin of the Canaanites has been filled up, that God will give the land into the hand of the patriarchs and their descendants. And so we have this image here where this later author or redactor is actually looking back at a time when Abraham was entering into the land, peaceably living with the Canaanites and sacrificing, devoting himself to Yahweh even among them. And you'll even see other images of this, for example, in Genesis 14, before Abraham goes out to save Lot, he's dwelling at peace with the Canaanites. And in Genesis 13:7, again, we get a note that at that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites lived in the land. Now, because this is almost the same phrase as the other, except with the addition of the Perizzites, we can attribute this to a similar time frame. And remember that Genesis chapter 13 is all about Abraham and Lot having this tension. They have too much stuff and they have to separate. And so again, even though they're separating and Lot's the one leaving and Abraham is the one that's staying in the worst part of the land, Abraham is among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And now going back to chapter 14, when Abraham heard that his nephew had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in the house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Again, this is Genesis 14:14. Now, you might be asking, how's this a Post-Mosaica? What in this gives away that this was not written by Moses? Well, actually, it's the name Dan, since Dan will only be named after its ancestor, who, following Joshua's conquest on Canaan, comes and takes that land, and then it's named after their ancestor Dan because they took it over. So at the very least, this passage must have been redacted or authored by somebody living at least at the end of Joshua's conquest, if not even later. But it seems that they're assuming this later place name. So either way, it seems that this is probably somebody living a little bit after, if not during the time of Judges, or after that into the monarchy. But they assume that this is just the name that this place has been known by. And so it actually seems like it's fair to see this as either one, there could have been a redactor. The story was already being passed along and had already been written down or whatever. And then later, somebody had changed the name that before used to be there. Say this place was called Jebelullah. Now, that's not a real name of a place. But then after Dan came and conquered it, it was named Dan. So this later person who's aware of Dan conquering this place and knows that people in his contemporary audience just assume that that place is named Dan could have changed that name, taken away Jebelullah, and replaced it with the name Dan. Or if not that, it seems that probably a lot, if not all, of Genesis chapter 14 could have been written by a later author. Now, that doesn't mean that it didn't really happen or that it didn't take place. Remember that even with the traditional view that Moses wrote the whole of the Torah, that view comes with the idea that it was passed down orally to him, or that God revealed to him the story of the Torah and Moses wrote that down. But either way, you still, as somebody who takes the traditional view that Moses wrote the Torah, you tend to take the view that the things in the Torah also historically happened. In the same way, even if this whole paraclete or story had been written by a later author or redactor, it could still nonetheless be a historical possibility, seeing as God in the same way could have revealed this to the later author, or it could have been passed down as it seems that it was. And in fact, I've seen a video by Carmen Imes where she even mentions how archaeologists have uncovered a sanctuary that looks like Melchizedek may have been the person who was serving as the priest in that sanctuary. And Melchizedek is only found here in Genesis chapter 14, besides Psalm 110, in all of the Old Testament. So it was a monotheistic temple. It was a very early temple, and it had a slaughter site or an altar. So she says that this very well might have been Melchizedek's temple. It seems like we should take this as a historical event that actually took place. But at the same time, we should not be scandalized in thinking that this was written later. Now, this is actually my favorite of the Post-Mosaica. But in Genesis chapter 22, we have what in Judaism has been referred to from ancient times as the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac. This is the narrative where Abraham takes up his son Isaac to the top of a mountain in Moriah and is about to slaughter him, and then the angel of Yahweh stops him and provides something for him in its place. Theologically speaking, Abraham first has to send off his son Ishmael and Hagar into the wilderness, as God tells him to do in the chapter beforehand. And now his only progenitor, his only son that can pass down his family lineage, as Yahweh had promised him from the beginning that he would make him into a great family and bless all the families of the earth through him, now he only has Isaac. And Isaac he had taken after a lot of scheming and lying and tricking other kings into thinking his wife was actually his sister, and them almost sleeping with him, but God protecting her, and him also taking Hagar for himself, abusing her, sleeping with her, and making a son with her. And now it's on only to Isaac. And God says, if you've sinned thus far, then the payment for your sin is your son. You must show that you trust me if you're really going to have this blessing, and give up the one thing that I promised to you and that you've desired and cheated and lied to get from the very beginning. And it's only when he's right about to offer him up that God brings about the promise that it's actually through this son who, according to the later apostolic author of Hebrews, did, allegorically speaking, or in speaking in terms of significance, did die and was resurrected. In these terms, God is bringing about life and blessing and the whole family of Abraham through Isaac, when the angel of Yahweh promises to Abraham that it's through him that by himself, he swears that he will bring about blessing and salvation. So, all that being said, Abraham nonetheless sees a ram in the thicket. He takes it out and he slaughters it in its place, and he calls this mountain that the Lord will see to it, or the Lord will provide. And then there's this note in verse 14, the second half of it, that says, as it is said on this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Now, there are some interesting things about this. First, it's said as to this day. So from that time forward, even to that day, it had been said that on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Now, it is possible to see this as having been written during the time of Moses, since there are a few times that do refer to the Mount Sinai as the mountain of the Lord. However, the Israelites didn't spend much time at the mountain of Sinai, and there wouldn't have been too much time after that. There wouldn't have been as much significance in the phrase, on the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided. However, in both the story of 2 Samuel and Chronicles, we have this narrative where David sins in getting a census of all the land of Israel to see how many people there are. And then God brings about a plague that's destroying many people. And the angel of the Lord, just as it showed up on this mountain to tell Abraham that he didn't have to slay his son, comes and is about to strike Jerusalem. David comes in, buys a threshing floor right there at the top of the mountain, and he offers up a sacrifice to God, and the plague stops. Similar to the giving up of Isaac through his death, speaking in terms of significance, there will be blessing and life brought to all people. And here, through David's sacrifice, it atones for his own sin in seeing a census of all the people of Israel, and it provides atonement, just like Jesus will die just outside of Jerusalem on a hill, and he will atone for all of the people. And so this is actually really significant because it means that later on, probably after David had taken Zion, if not him actually making a sacrifice there in that same spot in the same hill, then that means that people looked at both of these stories, connected them, and saw a future coming of a sacrifice. Now, this could have been written sometime during the time of David, after Jerusalem had been retaken, to any time after that, even into the post-exilic period, when the people were awaiting somebody to atone for their sins and bring them back out of exile and restore them again. So this is why this is my favorite of the Post-Mosaica. And if anything, it actually seems that it adds even more significance, even Christological significance, to the story of the binding of Isaac. And moving on into Genesis chapter 32, verse 32, there's this whole story about Jacob, who has been wrestling with God, trying to cheat and lie and steal to get his own blessing that had been promised before his birth. And finally, he's about to go meet his brother Esau. But before that, he has to wrestle with this unnamed figure that only afterwards Jacob is going to claim had the very face of Yahweh. And then after that, he's going to see his brother Esau and tell his brother Esau that seeing his face is like seeing the face of Yahweh. And as he's wrestling with this figure, and again, trying to get this figure to bless him, as he's been doing throughout his whole life, as he tries to steal blessing from Yahweh, this figure tells him, "You're not going to know my name," and strikes him on the hip. And then there's this aside, this explanation that, therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is in the hip socket, because he, the angel of Yahweh, struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. This note that the Israelites continue to not eat the thigh muscle to some unspecified day seems to assume some editorial insertion. However, one ought not to assume that this day is the same as that added in other places, like above, where it says, "To this day, on the mountain of the Lord, it shall be provided." On the contrary, this tradition might either precede the giving of the law, where the people had this law that you don't eat the thigh muscle connected to the hip socket, because that's not found in the Torah, and there's no other place where that's mentioned, or it could be written at any other time, and it could just be that this tradition was not included into the Torah. Anyways, this is just kind of an interesting little etiological explanation inserted into the passage. I'm honestly not too sure as to what it means. If you have any ideas, please feel free to provide them below. It does seem this could have actually been written by Moses, but it's also possible that it could have been written anytime after. It's just an interesting aside either way. Either way, in Genesis 36:31, we're given a genealogy of Esau. And in the middle of that genealogy, it says, "These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom," Edom being the land of Esau, "before any king reigned over the Israelites." So again, Moses was not a king, so it couldn't have been Moses. The first king to reign in Israel, actually this is interesting Bible trivia, is Abimelech in the book of Judges. He makes himself king, although it probably wasn't over all of Israel. As we see in Judges, a lot of the tribes are divided. They're finding their own territories and doing stuff within that, but it's more of a confederation of tribes than it is one united nation. Either way, that's just a single king. He dies, and then there's no more kingship until Saul is anointed king by Samuel. So it seems that this must have been written after they had at least that one king, Abimelech, reign, but probably even later in the monarchical period after they had at least some few kings reigning. It says before any king reigned over the Israelites. So it seems that whoever wrote this had had at least a few kings reign in Israel. Those are all the Post-Mosaica in Genesis. Jumping forward, we go to Exodus chapter 16, verse 35. And it says that the Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to a habitable land. They ate manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. Now, in this second statement, it seems that it's re-saying what it said in the first statement, just in different words. So this is actually half a Post-Mosaica, because it could be possible that Moses wrote this reflecting back and looking on the manna narrative. However, it also says until they came to a habitable land. So perhaps this was actually written after they had come into the land. Coming to think of it, it has the same note in Joshua. After they come into the land, it says that the manna finally stopped whenever they crossed over the Jordan. And they could have only known that the manna would stop once they came into that land after they had come into that land, which of course Moses had not. So this could have been written by Moses. Sorry, this could not have been written by Moses, but this could have been written by Joshua or anyone after him. But probably not Moses, since up until they came into the land, starting when they had come into the land until the end of Moses' life and after they had been eating manna. And so Moses would not have been able to reflect on the time when they stopped eating manna because they entered into the land. He didn't enter into the land. Numbers 12:3. Now, this is actually a pretty famous Post-Mosaica. This is when Moses' siblings, both Miriam and Aaron, come against him and rebel against him and challenge his authority and ask why he's the one that's chosen and who God speaks through. Why is he so important as this presumed prophet? And it says, now the man Moses was very humble, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth. And then Moses falls on his face. And, Moses talks about how he's not really that great of a person. Scholars today, many note that this word actually refers to being pious or devout. But anyways, it would seem interesting if Moses wrote that he was the most humble, or even pious or devout person in the whole face of the earth. It's possible, by the inspiration of God's Spirit, that he could be realistic and humble at the same time. However, it seems that it could have been written by just about anyone after him, or even around his time, but probably not him. It actually is a possibility that whoever wrote this wrote what we will see is going to be the last Post-Mosaica at the end of the Torah. But either way, this is an interesting one that I've even seen conservative traditional scholars bring up as an example of a Post-Mosaica. And then going back further towards the end of Numbers in chapter 26, verses 29 through 32, it reads, "And of Hefer, the clan of the Heferites." Now, you might be asking, Michael, how is this a Post-Mosaica? It's simply a genealogy. See, unlike the other genealogies in this same census, this is a census at the end of Numbers that's kind of like a repetition that you're supposed to compare to the census at the very beginning of Numbers. Unlike the other genealogies in this same census, see, for example, verses 57 through 59 of the same chapter, Moses and Aaron's, and how it extends 5 generations from the father's side and only 3 from the mother's. Their father, Amram, married his aunt according to verses 58 through 59. Unlike this census, this genealogy that runs 5 to 3 generations, Manasseh's generation goes for 9 generations, including Manasseh, just like we included Aaron and Moses in the counting of theirs. While Moses will live to 120 years old, according to Deuteronomy 34, verse 7, Manasseh's genealogy extends twice as many generations as Moses' own. At the minimum, this genealogy would have had to have been recorded generations later. This would also give good reason to see this whole genealogy as having been written at a much later date with the help of other ancient documentaries. So see, for example, Genesis 5:1. Oh, and I actually forgot to mention that, but actually, I'll get into this later in the video, but later in this video, I'm going to explore times where it refers to other sources that Moses or whatever author or editor of the Torah used in helping them write the Torah. So we'll actually jump into this later in the video rather than earlier. Either way, in this same census, we see in, again, same chapter 26 of Numbers, verse 65b, that not one of them was left, that is the Israelites, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun, and that's referring those who go into the land, or those who died just before then. So again, it's possible that Moses could have written this, but again, Moses is one of the people that dies because he had rebelled against God, and that's going to happen in the end of Deuteronomy. So Joshua is a candidate for writing this, but also anybody else could have written this. But it seems like this was written at a later time after Moses, since Moses is one of the people who's going to die. Now, while you might ask, does this mean that everything written after this in Numbers and all of Deuteronomy wasn't written by Moses? Well, we will get into the subject of Deuteronomy because that is an interesting case in and of itself. However, it ought to be noted that the book of Numbers, narrative speaking, goes a little bit further on, and then Deuteronomy is kind of like a speech of Moses. It should be inserted earlier in, because at the end of Numbers, Moses goes up onto a mountain to see the land. And then similarly in Deuteronomy, after his speech, we're given the same narrative where he goes up on the mountain and is shown the whole land. So you don't have to take that view, although I will give some arguments that point to a later view of the dating of Deuteronomy. Now, this is an interesting one that I think a lot of translations try to undo and write as if it was written by Moses. But in Numbers 35a, the first half of the verse, when it's talking about the cities of refuge that manslayers may run to and flee for protection, it says, "You shall designate 3 cities beyond the Jordan." That is on the other side of the Jordan. So this statement should be designated for an author who assumes that they have already crossed over the Jordan, if not have been living there for some time. This therefore excludes Moses, who never crossed the Jordan, but could be anyone from any time from the time of the Canaanite conquest to beyond. And this is interesting because this phrase is repeated a couple times throughout Deuteronomy, meaning that this same author or somebody who similarly lived beyond the Jordan could have been the same person who's helping writing or editing Deuteronomy and who's giving us this later recounting of what happened in the time of the Torah. And he's not even hiding from his contemporary audience that he's writing from a later time, because he's writing from their assumed point of view as well, where they're already on the side of the Jordan that they need to be on, looking forward to the time when they're on the other side. So, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1, the first half, it opens up saying, "These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan. Again, same phrase. And in Deuteronomy 3, verse 8, on the last half of the verse, it says, "So at that time we took from the two kings of the Amorites of the land beyond the Jordan." Again, assuming this later author. So we have this repeated a couple times. It seems that there's somebody writing later, assuming that the Israelites had crossed over into the land and are living on the other side of the Jordan. Then in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 28, it says that the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger, fury, and great wrath, and cast them into another land, as is now the case. And this is referring to the Canaanites. That is, just as God has removed Israel from their land in their case, saying, as is now the case, as is the case that the Israelites had been removed and uprooted from their land in the anger, fury, and great wrath of God and cast into another land, so God will remove the Canaanites from the land before Israel, according to the time of Moses. This then indicates that there was a post-exilic author or redactor, at least in this instance, if not the other cases or the majority or all of Deuteronomy. So this is really interesting. Throughout Deuteronomy, Moses is giving his final farewell speech before he goes up into the land. And remember that this is inserted into a point in time chronologically that would have been just before the end of Numbers. However, Deuteronomy is its whole own book. And Moses is giving this farewell speech all throughout. And Moses is speaking to, it's interesting because he will talk and give advice to the people in Deuteronomy about what they're supposed to do whenever they go into the land, since Moses can't go into the land with them because Moses also rebelled against God and is not going to be permitted to enter into the land. So he has to give this speech warning them, giving them their history of what it was like as they wandered through the wilderness, while also telling them what they will do, how they will sin and fail and go into exile once they enter into the land, how they can't stay in the land because of their disobedience. They need a circumcision of the heart. But he says to them that they are the very people who were at Sinai. They were the people who heard the giving of the law and they were there with Moses and had rebelled against him. And that's why they're not entering into the land, as is given earlier in the Torah. But in Deuteronomy, he also says that these same people are going to enter into the land. But this is impossible because the same people that received the giving of the law at Sinai were the people who rebelled all throughout and even leading up to going and scouting out the land and coming back and saying they can't take it. These people are the very people barred from entering into the land. But Moses says that it's them and not their fathers, not their children. It's them themselves who were at Sinai and received the law. And at the same time, he speaks to them throughout the speech as if they're going to enter into the land. So it's like this collective memory of Israel, where this writer or this editor who's unashamedly referring to Moses' speech and his words as if they're written way earlier in the past, but at the same time, it's words to them that day. And it's like it's speaking to every single generation from Moses's up until the post-exilic time, saying, you were given the law. It wasn't your ancestors that received the law. It was you yourself. And you have a responsibility to keep them. However, you won't. You will fail to keep them. You will sin and lie and cheat and adultery and murder and cause bloodshed. And that will have you cast out of the land in the same way that I'm going to cast out the Canaanites. And so it provides this perspective that even as all that the Torah told had happened with the past, the first children of Israel, it had been with all the children of Israel. They too had grumbled against Moses and their ancestors. They too had received the law at Sinai and are going to be incapable of keeping it. And there will be the reason that they end up in exile and are thrown out of the land in the same way that the Canaanites were. So I see all that as a very strong reason to believe that Deuteronomy actually was written by a later post-exilic author. And this is the view that many scholars talk about. Even Tim Mackey talks about it in the BibleProject podcast. And this is just, actually, if anything, it seems to add significance and weight to the book of Deuteronomy. And it gives us the perspective to read Numbers and the rebellion narratives as actually being ourselves, as the apostles themselves do. And as they tell others that Numbers was actually written for them, as a warning and as guideposts to say, don't do this again. It puts us in the perspective not of the righteous and those who did what they were supposed to do, but those who had sinned and rebelled against God and who were therefore forbidden from coming into rest. And if we did come into rest, we are also the people who took ourselves out of rest by being just like the Canaanites and sinning like them. So it's just a very deep, profound evidence that Moses probably didn't write Deuteronomy, but if anything, that ought to strike us all the more. And going on even further towards the end, we see in 31:24, it says, when Moses had finished writing down in a book the words of this law to the very end. Now, since Moses could not have naturally written about his death at the end of Deuteronomy, in chapter 34, verses 5 through 6, the end of the book referred to in this verse must be the law in Deuteronomy. This seems to ascribe this verse and all the verses after to some later scribe who then attached Moses' song in 32 and his blessing in 34 to this book. When the scribe wrote, one cannot know for sure. However, based on the other post-Mosaica throughout Deuteronomy, as I had just explained, it seems that a post-exilic redactor would make the most sense. And then, I'm not going to read this, but all of Deuteronomy 34 pretty much seems to have been written by somebody later. And it reflects on Moses going up and dying and nobody knowing where he was buried until this day, and the Israelites weeping for him 30 days after. And then it says that never since has a prophet in Israel risen like Moses. Now, you could attribute this to Joshua, and you could say that Joshua wrote this, but that would be quite insignificant since Joshua would have been the only prophet, and yes, according to ancient faith of Judaism, Joshua was a prophet. It would mean that he would have been the only prophet that had lived since Moses, and he hasn't even lived his whole life. But if this was a post-exilic redactor, then this would actually be very significant. This would mean that this end of the Torah is actually looking forward to Jesus. Even since the very beginning of the end of the Old Testament, these authors and redactors and later editors have been looking forward to Jesus as the new coming Moses. And so there's actually a newfound beauty in the fact that Moses did not and could not have written the whole of the Torah. So that seems undeniably to not have been written by Moses. Now, I want to, before I continue on and talk about the significance of this and some of the seeming problems with this view, I want to talk and explain how you could still take a fundamentalist approach and read this as if the whole thing was written by Moses. Yes, Moses could have written as a prophet with divine inspiration who wrote from the third perspective, as if he was taken out of his body. He could have written about the future and about his death, nobody knowing where his body was before he died, according to the inspiration of God. And he could have explained that, okay, for 30 days after my death, the Israelites will mourn, and written from the third perspective after he had died. He could have written to this day, and those things could have happened until his day, but they would have been actually less significant. It would have been unreasonable for him to have written about the other side of the Jordan, having lived on that side of the Jordan, and not having any need to do that. And you would wonder why God would inspire him to do such a thing. But even if you take this view, this doesn't seem to align much with Orthodox doctrine, the belief of the bodily resurrection and the importance of the physical and material as much as the immaterial, seeing as God has made both of them. From this view, it seems that Moses isn't really writing the Torah himself, but is being overpowered and over-controlled by God. And it's as if God is forcing his hand to write. And we know that this is not the case for the inspiration of the scriptures, as authors have their own unique writing styles. They use words from their own times. They write differently from one another. The whole Bible isn't written in the same style. It has different styles. It has different modes. It has different genres, different epithets and names to refer to God and to other people. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make orthodox sense to believe that Moses had been so overpowered by God that he wrote all of this and that he was overpowered by God. Further, it's inconsistent with the fundamentalists, who most of which tend to be Protestants, to so rigidly hold to this belief that Moses must have authored all of the Torah because of tradition. The view that Moses wrote the Torah or the Pentateuch actually comes from tradition, not from the Torah itself. There are times in the Torah where it does talk about Moses writing certain parts, like when they battle against the Amalekites in Exodus chapter 17, and God tells Moses to write about that. And in Exodus 20 through 24, Moses is said to have written the scroll of the covenant. And in the second pair of the Ten Commandments, Moses is said to have written that down. There are multiple times that Moses is said to have written things down. There is no claim that Moses wrote down the stories of Genesis. There are multiple things that it doesn't say that Moses wrote them down. So I take those views as being real, as Moses actually having written those down. However, I think we ought to take a more flexible view of the authorship of Moses, and we ought to not impose our own views according to tradition that's been passed down to us on the Bible, but rather ought to read the Bible on its own terms and allow it to redefine authorship for ourselves. Because as I'm about to give examples, we'll even see that the Bible itself claims that these authors were relying on other texts and sources to help them out in writing what they did. So I have also, as I've been reading through the Torah, taken notes, and there are two sources listed in the Torah that were used for helping write the Torah. So the first happens actually all the way back in Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. And this is, if you'll remember, the first genealogy after Cain's in the Torah. And it says that it's from the book of the generations of Adam. So there was a book that had this census, this genealogy, and Moses apparently had his hands on it, or whoever, later author or redactor, had his hands on it and wrote from this book of the generations of Adam. And also in Numbers 21:14, there is a book of the wars of Yahweh, and there's a quotation from that. And so whether or not Moses wrote the rest of it, he was still relying on this. And so it's this idea that God speaks to people in their own times by their own words in their own ways, and he uses their styles to speak to their people. This is similar, again, to the Orthodox view of Jesus's two natures or hypostases relating to each other. Just as Jesus's human and divine nature lived and coexist together, and they didn't mingle or become one, but they coexisted together in harmony. In the same way, God's Spirit and human authors who had human perspectives and human beliefs and assumptions still wrote the scriptures together in unity. And as Peter says, they were guided by the Holy Spirit, not so overpowered by him and having their bodies ripped away from themselves and taken over by a prophet so that they might write with their eyes rolling in the back of their heads. On the other hand, it's that God gave them supernatural powers to write the scriptures. And so if we're going to read the scriptures and say that the scriptures have authority over us, we should allow them to have authority over us, not just in the content and in the narratives they tell, but in the style and in the way that they tell it. And if the style points to multiple authors or later authors, then we ought to take that for consideration, because the Bible is authoritative in all ways, in all aspects, and in all areas. So again, there still seem to be some problems, especially if you're an Orthodox Christian. They appear in the New Testament. How could it be that in Luke chapter 24, verse 44, Jesus says to his disciples, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled"? Isn't Jesus here attributing the law to Moses? As we said, it is said multiple times in the Pentateuch itself that Moses wrote parts of the Pentateuch. However, notice how it says the law of Moses, and then it says the Psalms. This is a reference to the threefold division of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament that Jesus and other Jews in his days would have used to refer to it by. I even have a whole video on that and how all of that is organized and everything. It would have had the first 5 books or Pentateuch, the prophets early and later, and a third part known as the writings. So it's a different division and different ordering than what we know today. But the third division was often referred to as the writings. The first of the books in the writings was known as the Psalms. And Jesus probably isn't just saying that Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, but none of the other writings are referring to him. He's probably using the term Psalms to refer to the whole of the third section of the Old Testament or the Tanakh, the writings. So he's doing what's called a synecdoche, where you use one word or one term to refer to a broader whole within it. In the same way, that same logic seems to be applicable to the law of Moses. Moses did write the law, but there are parts that were contributed or added or redacted by later authors and editors. Now, when he refers to the law of Moses, it seems that if we want to be all literal about it, we could apply that same synecdoche to the law. What Moses wrote about those little parts, sure, he only wrote those some parts of the Torah, but the whole of it, he's attributing to Moses, and he's speaking to his own people and his time in their way. In the same way, that the Bible as a whole speaks to the people of their time, in their days, and in their ways. And similarly, we can refer to the Psalms as the Psalms of David, David's Psalms. But while David did write the majority of the Psalms, there are a lot of Psalms written by Moses, the Korahites, and even others, like his son Solomon. So, in the same way that we can refer to the Psalms as being written by David generally, we can refer to the law being written by Moses generally. And again, going to the Bible and seeing how the Bible refers to itself being written, I want to give another example that's even clearer on how these biblical authors thought about the authors. In the opening of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verses 2 through 3, it says, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths." Now, while the second half of this, talking about the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness to prepare the way of the Lord and make straight his paths, is indeed from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, the first half, about sending the messenger ahead of him, is from Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. But both of these are referred to as having been written by Isaiah. So he had a broader view of authorship. And let me give one other example from the legal and half-brother of Jesus, Jude, who wrote his own epistle, 1 chapter long, which you may or may not have read because it's not as popular, the book of Jude. Now, this 1 chapter long epistle has in it, verses 14 through 15, a reference to a pseudepigraphon or an extra biblical text, now known by scholars as 1 Enoch. You may have heard it just called Enoch. He says, "It was also about these that Enoch, in the 7th generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, See, the Lord is coming with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all and to convict all the ungodly of all the deeds of ungodliness that they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him." Now, this is quoting from an extra biblical text, 1 Enoch chapter 1, verse 9. And Jude is even referring to it as if it's a prophecy. Now, would you say then, for Jude to have attributed this to Enoch, that this must have been passed along orally until it was written down in the book of Enoch? If so, then doesn't that make the book of Enoch inspired? Or could it have been passed down all the way, been written in the book of Enoch, and been passed down to Jude separately and also written down by him? How would he know that this was inspired? The interesting thing is, this is also not entirely written by Enoch. In fact, this passage from Enoch, like much of the pseudepigrapha and 1 Enoch itself, is taken from other biblical passages, namely Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2, Zechariah 14:5, and Isaiah 66, 15 through 16. So he is attributing these passages that were originally from the Hebrew Bible that got adapted into 1 Enoch. So it's almost certain that this was not passed down orally, especially because the end finished product of 1 Enoch, which is a composite text in and of itself, talks about Enoch writing these things down, putting it in a book, burying it so that it could be read by later generations. An obvious explanation for whoever was writing this anonymously for how this could have been written by Enoch, survived the flood, and not have been known through all those years. But this is actually taking from all these later passages in the Hebrew scriptures. So Jude is actually referring to this amalgamation of Hebrew scriptures that are put together by whoever authored 1 Enoch as if Enoch himself had said it. So we ourselves need to have a more open, flexible view of authorship. And when we come to the scriptures, we need to allow the scriptures to inform our understanding of what authorship is and who could have authored what, rather than imposing our traditional understanding onto the scriptures. Because we know that tradition is many times beautiful and great and good, but we also have to come to it using critical thinking and imagining places where it might have gone wrong and where it might need to be redirected. Because as tradition creates us, we also create tradition. So I think this is helpful. I think this gives new theological perspectives that are quite rich to earlier parts of the Torah. And at the same time, it gives us an open mind and allows us to be influenced by the scriptures and their view of who authored it, who the authors are, and how they wrote. I wrote my own essay on the authorship of Isaiah and why there are probably three authors, some writing during the exile and some writing after the exile. And you can read that on my website, as is linked below. And I'm also linking multiple sources that I referred to down below in the description. See also my document called the De-Documentary Hypothesis that I talk about in my other video that's going to show up here. You can watch that if you haven't already. And I will also have all my notes on the Post-Mosaica linked there and in my website. So go ahead and check that out. If you haven't already, make sure you also subscribe, like this video, share it with somebody who you think might think this is interesting. And I will see you in my next video.